Mount Everest is a graveyard of dead people. We found the first body at 28,000 feet, half buried in the ice, arms outstretched, frozen in place like it had been reaching for something just out of reach. I'd seen bodies before. Everest was littered with them. Everyone who climbs knows about the dead up here, the ones who never made it back down. But this one was different, too fresh. The gear was modern, the oxygen tank still clipped in place. It looked like someone who had only just died, but that wasn't possible. No recent climbers were missing. I checked. Maybe someone summited from the north side and collapsed here. Ben, my climbing partner, suggested, adjusting his goggles against the icy wind. But I could hear the doubt in his voice. Everest doesn't move bodies. Once you die here, you stay exactly where you fell, unless someone takes you down, which almost never happens. So how the hell did this one end up here? And why did it look like it had been frozen for years? The wind screamed as we moved past it, ice crunching under our boots. We were less than a day from the summit, deep in the death zone, where the air is so thin, your brain starts to die with every breath. But something about that corpse stayed in my head, nagging at me. And as we made camp that night, shoveling snow to carve out a space for the tents, I realized something that made my blood run cold. The body, its face. I'd seen it before, and not just in pictures. I barely slept. The wind outside screamed like something alive, rattling the tent walls, shaking the ground beneath us. Everest had its own voice, its own hunger, and tonight, it sounded starving. Ben was already asleep, buried in his sleeping bag, his breath shallow and slow from the altitude. I lay awake, staring at the fabric above me, my body exhausted but my mind racing. That face, I had seen it last year, on another expedition. A climber named Owen Clark. He had disappeared near the Hillary Step. His body never recovered, except now it was here, fresh, frozen, wearing the same expression of terror I had seen in the old summit photos. I sat up, the tent too small, too suffocating. My hands were shaking, though not from the cold. I reached for the radio, fingers numb against the plastic, and clicked it on. Base camp, this is Sam. You copy? Static. Then, a whisper. Not in English. Not in any language I recognized. A low, dragging voice, like something breathing inside the frequency. I dropped the radio. The sound didn't stop. It filled the tent, crawling through the thin air, curling around my skull. I turned to wake Ben, but he was already sitting up, eyes open, staring past me at the tent door. His face was blank, pale, his lips barely moving. And then, in a voice that wasn't his, he whispered, "They move at night." Ben wasn't asleep. He wasn't awake either. His breath was slow, controlled, like something was keeping him steady. His lips barely moved, but I heard the words again, softer this time, like a breath being stolen by the wind. They moved at night. My skin went cold. I reached out and shook him hard. "Ben, wake up." He blinked, the vacant look fading, his body jerking like he had just been dropped into himself. His breath hitched. Confusion clouded his face, then fear. What happened? He looked around, eyes darting to the radio, then the tent door. "Did you hear that?" I didn't answer, because I didn't need to. We both heard it. Outside, the wind had changed. It wasn't howling anymore. It was whispering, a slow, rhythmic pulse of sound that didn't match the gusts of air rolling off the summit. My gut twisted. I unzipped the tent slowly, careful, my breath caught in my throat. I wasn't sure what I expected to see, but when I looked out, the body was gone. The spot where it had been, just hours ago, empty. No drag marks, no footprints, no sign that anything had ever been there at all. My hands clenched the fabric of the tent, my breath clouding in front of me. This was wrong, completely wrong. Everest doesn't take bodies, it keeps them. But this one had left on its own. Ben was behind me now, silent, staring past me into the darkness. I followed his gaze. Up ahead, barely visible through the swirling snow, something was standing at the edge of our camp, not moving, not speaking, just watching. My chest tightened as my mind tried to make sense of what I was seeing. It was a climber. The gear was all there. The boots, the oxygen mask, the heavy layers of insulated clothing. But there was something off. The posture was too rigid, too still, like a puppet waiting for its strings to be pulled. My fingers instinctively wrapped around my ice axe. "Who the hell is that?" I whispered, but Ben didn't answer, because the thing ahead of us took a step forward. Ben yanked me back hard, nearly knocking me off my feet. My heart slammed against my ribs as the figure moved again, slow and deliberate, like it was learning how to walk. The snow twisted around it, distorting its shape. But I knew that whoever this was, they weren't human anymore. "Get inside," I hissed. We ducked back into the tent, zipping it up fast. the wind outside rattling the fabric like fingers dragging across the nylon. My breath came in short bursts, my mind screaming for logic, for answers, but there weren't any. The radio crackled again. This time, the static was broken, uneven. Then, a voice, faint, distant. Sam, Sam, Sam. It was my name. Over and over, a weak, gasping repetition, like someone struggling to speak through frozen lungs. Then, a second voice, not calling my name, calling Ben's. But this voice wasn't weak. It was mocking. Ben, Ben, come outside. Ben grabbed my arm, his grip too tight, his face drained of color. I knew what he wanted to ask. How do they know our names? But I didn't have an answer, because deep down, I already understood. They had always known. Everest is a graveyard, a place where the dead stay. But we had made a mistake. We thought they stayed still. We thought they never moved. The whispering outside grew louder. The wind rattled the tent harder. And then, the zipper started to move. From the outside, something was coming in. The zipper slid down an inch, then another. My body locked up, every instinct screaming at me to do something. But I couldn't move. I could barely breathe. Ben had his pistol drawn, hands shaking, eyes locked on the opening as if he was seeing his own death crawling toward him. The wind outside was wrong. It wasn't just howling anymore. It was breathing, a slow inhale, a slow exhale, like something massive, something ancient, was just beyond the fabric, waiting to pull us out. I forced myself to move. Survival first, fear later. My fingers wrapped around my ice axe, the grip slick with sweat. I lunged forward, grabbing the zipper, yanking it up hard, sealing us inside again. For a second, everything stopped. The wind, the whispers, the movement outside. Just a deep, unnatural silence, like the mountain itself was listening. Then, the pressure started. The tent walls caved inward. The poles groaned as something massive pressed against them, surrounding us, testing the strength of the fabric, not just from one side, from every side, like hands pushing in, like bodies pressing against it from all angles. The thin walls bulged, shapes forming in the fabric, faces, smiling. I clamped my teeth together, pushing my back against Ben, both of us bracing against the weight trying to crush us. Then, right next to my ear, a whisper. Come outside, Sam. It's time to join them. I snapped. I shoved forward with everything I had, forcing my way out of the tent. Ice axe raised. The cold slammed into me like a wall, nearly knocking me backward. But I didn't care. I needed to see. I needed to know what we were up against. And that's when I saw them. Not one, not two, dozens. Standing in the snow, perfectly still, bodies frozen in place like mannequins. Their climbing gear was outdated, torn, stitched together from different decades. Some of them I recognized, climbers who had died years ago. Their bodies supposedly lost to the mountain, but they weren't lost. They were here, for us. And then, one of them stepped forward, and I realized I knew him. Owen Clark, the climber who had vanished last year, the one we had found frozen in the snow, but whose body had disappeared. He smiled, his frostbitten lips splitting open, and then he spoke. You shouldn't be here. Ben came out behind me, his breath ragged, pistol clutched in his shaking hands. His eyes darted between the figures in the snow, his mind breaking apart just like mine. This isn't real, he whispered, but it was. It was more real than anything we had ever faced on this mountain. Owen took another step toward us. His movements were too smooth, too unnatural. He wasn't alive, but he wasn't dead either. None of them were. Their bodies had been claimed by Everest, but something had kept them here. Something had made them part of the mountain. Owen, I said, my own voice sounding distant. What happened to you? His head tilted, that same rotted smile never fading. The same thing that will happen to you. The wind shifted. More whispers crawled through the air, curling around my thoughts, pulling at something deeper than fear. I took a step back. We're leaving. Owen laughed, not a real laugh. A hollow, empty sound that didn't match the movement of his mouth. Then, in that same unnatural, layered voice, he whispered, no one leaves. The others started moving, not fast, not running, just walking forward, closing the distance between us. Some of them had no faces, just smooth sheets of frozen skin, where eyes and mouths should have been. Then the nearest climber, a woman missing half her face, lunged at Ben. He barely had time to scream before she grabbed him, pulling him down into the snow. Ben went down hard, his scream muffled by the thick snow. The thing on top of him, the woman missing half her face, moved fast, too fast. Her fingers clawed at his suit, trying to pull him deeper into the ice. Ben struggled, kicking, thrashing, but she was unnaturally strong. Her broken, frostbitten mouth stretched open as if she was about to bite into him. I didn't think. I swung my ice axe, the sharp edge buried into the side of her skull with a sickening crunch. For a second, nothing happened. Then her body jerked, her limbs twisting unnaturally, as if something inside her had just realized she'd been hit. She let out a slow, wet gasp. Not in pain, in disappointment. Then she collapsed, her body going still, her grip on Ben finally loosening. Ben scrambled away, gasping for air, his hands covered in her frozen blood. But there was no time to breathe. The others were still coming. Their bodies moved wrong, some twitching, some dragging themselves forward on broken limbs. Their eyes, those that had them, held nothing. No anger, no hunger, just inevitability. Like this wasn't a fight, like they had already won. We need to go. I grabbed Ben, pulling him to his feet. He was shaking, his gun still in his hand, but his mind was barely holding together. The weight of what he'd just seen, what we were up against, was settling into him. He knew, just like I did. The wind shifted again, and the whispers came back. Only this time, I understood them. Not words, not a language, just meaning. A deep buried knowledge that had always been here, waiting for us to hear it. Stay, stay, stay. We ran, and the mountain chased us. We weren't heading back to camp anymore. We were just running. The snow was deep, the air too thin, but fear pushed us forward. Our only goal was to get lower. The higher we stayed, the closer we were to becoming like them. The lost climbers, the ones who never left. Behind us, they followed, not running, not rushing, just walking. But they didn't have to be fast. The wind carried their voices, twisting them into things I knew weren't real. I heard my father's voice, even though he'd been dead for years. I heard my mother calling my name. I heard my own voice, whispering back at me. Ben wasn't doing any better. He was moving slower, his steps uneven. I grabbed his arm, shook him. Ben, stay with me. He didn't answer at first. Then, finally, in a voice that barely sounded like his own, he whispered, I don't think I'm me anymore. My stomach twisted. I looked into his eyes, and for the first time, I saw it was empty. That's when we saw it. A light, faint, flickering. A small weather outpost half buried in the snow. Old, probably abandoned, but it didn't matter. It was shelter. We make it there. We survive, I said. A lie, but we had to try. Ben didn't respond. He just kept moving, his breath ragged, his body not entirely his own anymore. The things behind us didn't stop. They never stopped. And the whispers in the wind turned into laughter, because they knew we weren't escaping. We were just running in circles. We reached the outpost just as Ben's legs started to give out. The door was half buried in snow, the small building barely visible against the white. It looked abandoned, a forgotten relic of some failed expedition. But it was shelter. I slammed my shoulder into the door, ice cracking as it finally gave way, and we stumbled inside. The air was thick with cold, every surface covered in frost. The outpost was small, one room, a rusted metal desk, a broken down radio, and an old cot in the corner. But the most important thing, the door locked from the inside. I shoved it closed, sliding the bolt into place. For now, we were safe. Ben collapsed against the wall, his breath ragged, his eyes glassy. I don't feel right, he muttered, clutching at his arms like he was trying to hold himself inside his own body. He was pale, but it wasn't just the cold. It was something deeper. I crouched in front of him, shaking him. Stay awake, Ben. You hear me? He lifted his head, and for a split second, I didn't recognize him. His eyes, they weren't his anymore. They were too dark, too hollow. And then, the whispering came back. Not outside. Inside the outpost, I turned, my pulse hammering. The wind outside had stopped howling. The mountain was silent, but the whispers, they were closer now. They weren't coming from the storm anymore. They were inside the room. I spun toward the broken radio. The static crackled, low and uneven, like something breathing through the speaker. Then, a voice, not a recording, not a transmission, a voice speaking directly to me. You were always meant to stay. The breath in my lungs turned to ice. I stepped back, the words crawling under my skin. The radio was dead, completely disconnected, and yet it spoke. I turned to Ben, but he wasn't Ben anymore. His body was there, but his face was blank, like something had just turned him off. And then, slowly, his lips moved, and in my own voice, he whispered, "They're already inside you too." The door slammed open, and the dead walked in. The door burst open with a force that sent ice and snow exploding into the room. The wind outside was gone, but the cold that followed them in was deeper, sharper, unnatural. The dead moved slowly, stepping over the threshold like they had done this before, like they had walked into this room 100 times, over 100 years, and found someone like me waiting. Their bodies were still wrapped in climbing gear, Some of it modern, some of it old, tattered, stitched together from different eras of the mountain's victims. I recognized some of their faces. Others had no faces at all, just smooth frozen skin stretched over bone. Their boots crunched against the ice-covered floor as they came closer, their blackened fingers twitching, their heads tilting unnaturally. I backed away, my breath coming in short bursts. Ice axe raised. It wouldn't help. I knew that. The woman I had killed before, the thing that had attacked Ben, it hadn't screamed, it hadn't fought. It had just stopped moving, like it was waiting to be something else. Everest didn't just kill people, it took them, it kept them. And now, it wanted me. Ben stood next to me, staring blankly ahead. The color drained from his skin. His breath was slow, too slow. I shook him hard. Ben, snap out of it. But he barely blinked. He was hearing something I wasn't, something that had already gotten inside him. Then, without looking at me, he whispered, "We never should have come here." And then he turned toward them. I grabbed him. "Ben, no." But he stepped forward, like his body wasn't his anymore. Like he was answering something. The nearest climber reached out, its fingers stretching too long, too stiff, its touch barely brushing Ben's shoulder. And as soon as it did, his body froze. His back arched, his arms locked at his sides. His breath stopped. His eyes went black. Then he exhaled. And when he did, I knew he was gone. Ben turned his head toward me, his lips twitching at the edges. And in a voice that was his but not his, he whispered, "It's time, Sam. Stay with us." Then the dead reached for me. I ran. There was no thinking, no plan, just pure, blind instinct. I shoved Ben aside and sprinted for the door, my body screaming from exhaustion, lungs burning from the thin air. The dead didn't chase me. They didn't have to. They just turned, slowly, calmly, watching me run like it didn't matter, like they already knew how this ended. The storm outside was gone. The mountain was quiet. No wind, no howling, just me and the endless white. My boots pounded against the ice as I ran. The world around me warping, twisting. I wasn't sure if I was running toward base camp or deeper into the mountain. The path blurred, the horizon shifting. Everest had swallowed me whole. Then I saw the body, lying ahead in the snow, half buried, frozen solid, face turned upward, locked in an expression of terror. It was me. I stopped, my breath choking in my throat. I stared down at my own corpse, frozen and lifeless, like I had been here for years. The gear was mine. The oxygen tank was mine. The ice axe was still clutched in my dead, stiff fingers. I was already dead. A voice whispered behind me. Ben's voice. "You never left." I turned slowly. They were all standing there. The dead. The lost climbers. The ones who never came back. Ben was with them now. His face was blank. His body no longer his. His eyes, black, endless. He smiled at me. And for the first time, I understood. Everest doesn't kill people. It keeps them. The ones who die here never really leave. They become part of it. And now, so had I. The wind picked up again. The whispering fading. The storm swallowing everything in white. And then, I was gone. Mythical creature of Mount Everest. Mount Everest is a graveyard with a view. People think of it as a symbol of achievement, of pushing the human body to its limits. But for those of us who have climbed it, who have seen the bodies frozen in the ice, limbs curled as if still reaching for the summit, we know the truth. Everest doesn't care about you, and sometimes, neither does what lives up there. I didn't believe the stories at first. I'd climbed 6 of the 7 summits, conquered the world's deadliest peaks, survived avalanches, ice storms, and weeks at high altitude. I wasn't here for a myth. I was here for proof. A hidden predator lurking in the Himalayas, whispered about among Sherpas for centuries. Not a Yeti, not some ancient ghost, but something real, something that left no bodies behind. And that was why I joined this expedition, to find what was waiting above 26,000 feet, to prove that Everest's deadliest secret wasn't just the cold. There were 6 of us. Dr. Victor Kane, the expedition leader, a legend in the mountaineering world, with over a dozen summits under his belt. Annika Patel, glaciologist and survival expert. If anyone could explain the strange tracks found in past expeditions, it was her. Samir Dawa, our lead Sherpa. Born in the Himalayas, he had guided teams up Everest more times than he could count, but even he refused to speak about the stories. Mark West, cameraman, a documentary filmmaker who had filmed everything from war zones to deep sea dives. He was here to capture history. Lewis Carter, the youngest of us, an eager climber with something to prove. And me, Jack Calloway, a mountaineer first, a researcher second, and the only one who believed something was really up here. We set off from base camp under a clear sky. The air was thin, the cold biting, but nothing out of the ordinary. The first few days were brutal. As expected, ice walls, treacherous crevasses, the constant threat of frostbite. But then, the signs began. The first one was small, a strange set of tracks at Camp 2, pressed deep into the ice. Too deep for a snow leopard, too large for a human. The second was worse. Samir found claw marks on a rock face above the camp. He went pale, wouldn't speak for hours. And that night, something howled in the wind. Not the wind itself, something else. Something watching. By the time we reached Camp 3, the air had turned to razor blades. Every breath burned. Every step felt like moving through wet cement. Everest wasn't just about strength. It was about endurance, about knowing when to push forward and when to stop before the mountain swallowed you whole. But stopping wasn't an option, because something was following us. Mark was the first to notice. As he adjusted his camera, panning across the frozen ridges, his voice crackled through the radio. "Hey Jack, take a look at this." I shuffled over, keeping my balance on the ice. Mark handed me the camera, the screen flickering in the cold. At first, it looked like nothing, just the wind blowing across untouched snow. Then I saw it, a shape, a figure far up the ridge, near the rocks. Not a climber, not an animal, something big, something standing still, watching. I lowered the camera, turned toward the ridge. Nothing was there, no movement, no shadows. But my gut twisted. It had been there, and now it was gone. Samir said nothing when we told him. He simply tightened his harness, adjusted his ice axe, and kept moving. But I caught the way his hands shook. And that night, when the wind howled through the valley, I swore I heard something move outside the tents. Everest has a rule. If someone disappears up here, you don't go after them. Not because you don't care, because you'll die trying. It happened on the fourth night. We had set up Camp 4, perched at the edge of the death zone. The last stop before the final push to the summit. The oxygen was thin, our bodies weak, but we were so close. That's when we lost Louis. I woke up to yelling. Louis was gone. His tent was open, the flaps snapping in the wind. His boots were still inside, his oxygen mask too. But outside, only one set of footprints, leading away from camp, up the ridge. Annika grabbed my arm, her voice tight. He wouldn't leave without gear. He knows better. Samir's face was pale. No one leaves in the middle of the night. A beat of silence. Then I whispered what everyone was thinking. Unless he wasn't alone. We followed the tracks for 30 feet before they stopped. Just stopped. No sign of struggle. No body. No explanation. Just empty snow, like he had been lifted straight off the mountain. That's when I heard it. A deep, guttural breath. Not from the wind. From above. I turned my head slowly, heart hammering, and saw the shape in the darkness. Not human. Not an animal. Something big. Massive. Wrong. Perched high on the ridge. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. We all just stood there, staring at the dark shape perched above us on the ridge. It was huge, blending into the swirling snow. But the longer I looked, the clearer it became. This wasn't a man. It wasn't a yeti. It was something else. Its arms were too long, its torso thick with layers of matted fur, its legs bent at an unnatural angle. But the part that froze me in place, the eyes. They weren't the dull yellow glow of an animal. They were sharp, focused, intelligent, like it was studying us, like it knew exactly what we were thinking. Mark's breathing was rapid behind me. "Tell me you see that." Annika nodded slowly. "I see it." Lucas muttered something under his breath, gripping his ice axe like it would do anything against that. Samir, he didn't look. He just whispered, "Don't acknowledge it." Then, in the blink of an eye, it moved, not down the ridge, upper, like it was testing us, toying with us. And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, it was gone, swallowed by the storm. We didn't speak. We just turned back toward camp, moving as fast as our bodies allowed, hearts pounding, minds racing, because the message was clear. We weren't alone up here, and whatever it wasn't afraid. We reached Camp 4, sealed ourselves inside the tents, and barely spoke. Everyone was thinking the same thing. Louis was gone. No body, no struggle, no chance to save him. Just gone. I lay awake, staring at the tent ceiling, listening to the wind howl outside. But then I heard something else. A voice, faint, barely audible over the storm. A voice I shouldn't have heard. "Help me." I bolted upright, my breath catching. I waited, heart hammering. Then, again, a whisper. "Jack, help me." I scrambled out of my sleeping bag, unzipping the tent flap just enough to see outside. The wind was brutal, ripping through the camp, but between the flurries of snow, I saw it. Footprints, fresh, leading away from the tents. And there, just at the edge of the storm, a figure stood motionless, Louis. I stared through the storm, my breath fogging in the freezing air. He stood at the edge of the camp, or at least, something that looked like him. His face was pale, frostbitten, his jacket ripped, his posture wrong, too still, too perfect, and his eyes, not the terrified, desperate eyes of a man who had been lost in the death zone for hours. They were empty, unreadable, like something wearing a mask. Behind me, Samir stirred. "Get back inside." I ignored him, stepping forward. Louis, the figure didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there. Then, a flicker of movement. His mouth opened, but the wind swallowed the sound. His lips moved, struggling to form a single word. Help. It was his voice, but not his tone. Flat, hollow, like an echo of something that used to be human. I took a slow step back. My gut screamed at me to move, to get inside, to ignore whatever I was seeing. But I hesitated, because if there was even a chance that it was really him, then we had just left him to die. Samir's voice was harsh now. "Close the tent, Jack. Now." His fear was real, so I did the hardest thing I've ever done. I zipped the tent shut, and outside, in the storm, Louis did not move. He just kept standing there perfectly still. The wind rattled the tents, the temperature dropped, and the air inside was thick with silence. Then, sometime around 3 a.m., it happened. A scream, not from the storm, not from the wind, from inside the camp. I bolted upright as Mark's tent collapsed. Shouts, movement, chaos in the dark. Lucas unzipped the flap, shoving past me into the snow, his flashlight cutting through the whiteout. Mark, no answer. I grabbed my gear, stepping outside, the wind biting through my jacket like knives. Annika and Samir were already up, scanning the area. Mark's tent was shredded, the fabric ripped apart like it had been hit by a bear. But there were no tracks, no blood, no sign of Mark, just silence. Annika turned, her breath sharp. "Did anyone see what happened?" Lucas shook his head. "No," I heard him yell. Then, nothing. Samir's voice was low. "He is gone." Rachel clenched her jaw. "Gone where?" Something dragged him. Samir shook his head. "No." He pointed at the snow, at the spot where Mark's body should have been. Nothing. No struggle. No blood. No footprints. Like he had been lifted straight into the sky. Like Louis. I turned toward the ridge. I couldn't see it through the storm, but I could feel it. Something was up there, taking us one by one. And if we didn't figure out how to stop it, we'd be next. Nobody spoke as we left Camp 4. The air was thin, every breath a struggle, but none of us were thinking about oxygen anymore. Mark was gone, Louis was gone, and we still didn't know what had taken them. Samir led the way, his ice axe clutched tight in his gloved hand. He moved fast, his eyes locked ahead, avoiding our stares. He had seen something last night, we all had, but none of us wanted to talk about it, because speaking it out loud would make it real. As we climbed higher, the wind picked up, howling against the rock face. Visibility dropped to almost nothing, and soon, the only thing keeping us on track were the thin ropes left behind by past climbers. The storm was closing in fast. "We need to move faster," Annika said. Lucas gave a sharp nod. "We hit Camp 5, regroup, and figure out our next move." "Assuming we make it that far," I muttered. No one answered. It took 2 hours to reach the next plateau, a wide stretch of ice where we could stop and adjust our gear. My hands were numb inside my gloves, my legs aching from the brutal climb, but we couldn't rest for long. Lucas scanned the ridge above us, adjusting the strap of his backpack. "Something feels off." I didn't ask what he meant, because I felt it too, that creeping sensation, like we were being watched. Then Samir stiffened. He raised a hand, signaling for us to stop. His breathing was ragged, his head tilted slightly, as if listening for something. I stepped beside him. "What is it?" He pointed. I followed his gaze, and that's when I saw the footprints. At first, I thought they were ours. A deep trail of boot prints in the snow, weaving up the mountain ahead of us. But the longer I looked, the more I realized something was wrong. They weren't scattered like normal climbing tracks. They were perfect, even, deliberate, like whoever made them wasn't climbing, like they were walking. Lucas swore under his breath. "That's not possible." Annika knelt beside them, brushing snow away from the edges. "These prints are fresh." She looked up at me, her expression tight. Someone was just here. "But who?" I asked. Nobody had an answer. And then Samir pointed again, this time down the path we had just climbed. My stomach dropped. There were more footprints behind us, following our exact trail, step for step, like someone, or something, had been walking right behind us the entire time. A gust of wind roared through the mountain, kicking up loose ice and snow. I turned, scanning the storm, but saw nothing. No movement, No shadows, but I could feel it. Something was close. Something is coming. We need to go. Now, Samir said, his voice firm. No one argued. We tightened our gear and pushed forward, moving fast, ignoring the burn in our legs. The air grew thinner, the cold more brutal, but we didn't slow down, because the higher we went, the clearer it became. This wasn't just a creature hunting us. This was something that knew the mountain better than we did, something that had been leading us here all along. We moved fast. The tracks ahead of us led higher, toward the sheer rock face leading to Camp 5. But something about them felt wrong. They weren't just fresh. They were leading us somewhere. Lucas gritted his teeth as he climbed. I don't like this. Nobody does, Annika muttered. Samir stayed silent, but his breathing was uneven. His fingers clenched his ice axe tighter than before, his knuckles pale beneath his gloves. He knew something he wasn't saying. We pushed forward, step by step, forcing our way up the ridge. The wind picked up again, screaming through the rock wall like something alive. Then, the tracks ended, abrupt, clean, like whoever had made them had disappeared into thin air. I felt the blood drain from my face. Where the hell did they go? Lucas asked. Nobody answered, because there was only one explanation. They hadn't turned around, they hadn't fallen, they had been taken, and whatever had taken them was still here. Annika was the first to hear it, a low, distant vibration, not the wind, not shifting ice, something else, something deep below us. She dropped to her knees, pressing a gloved hand against the frozen ground. Do you feel that? I crouched beside her, and that's when I felt it too. A rumbling, a faint, unnatural pulse. Lucas's voice was tight. I think we should go back. Samir shook his head. No, there is no back. He gestured toward the valley below. I turned, and my stomach dropped. The storm had closed in behind us. The trail leading down to Camp 4 was gone. We had one way forward, and something wanted it that way. Then, the ice cracked. Just once. A deep, sharp snap beneath our feet. The mountain was hollow, and below us, something moved. The ice cracked again, louder this time, deeper. Something beneath us was shifting, waking up. I felt the vibrations through my boots, a steady pulse that didn't belong to the mountain. This wasn't an earthquake. This wasn't normal. This was something alive. Samir grabbed my arm, his fingers ice cold and shaking. We need to move. Now. I barely nodded before he was already climbing ahead, his ice axe striking the wall in rapid movements. Lucas and Annika followed, pushing forward with everything they had. None of us spoke, because we all felt it. The mountain was breathing. Then, a deep groan from below. The ice shattered. A massive crack split the ground beneath us, jagged and wide, as if Everest itself was splitting open. And from the depths below, a sound, a deep guttural clicking, like bones snapping in slow motion. A shape shifted in the darkness beneath the ice. Something massive, something with claws. We ran, scrambling up the ridge, digging our axes into the rock, moving faster than we thought possible. The air was thin, our muscles screaming for oxygen. But we didn't stop, because we couldn't, because it was coming. I risked a glance back, and my heart nearly stopped. It was crawling up the ice, massive, its skin pale and cracked like the glacier itself, long twisted limbs pulling it forward, its black eyes locked onto us. Not a yeti, not a beast, something older, something that had lived beneath Everest for centuries, a predator, and it had finally found its prey. Lucas slipped. His ice axe missed its mark, his body lurching sideways. I grabbed him by the harness, yanking him back just as a clawed hand slammed into the ledge beneath us, splitting the ice like glass. It screeched, a sound that sent ice and snow tumbling from the cliffs above. We had seconds, one chance to survive. Samir reached the next ledge, pulling out a flare from his pack. He turned back, his face set with grim determination. Go, now, Samir, I started, but I already knew. He lit the flare. A burst of red light filled the storm, reflecting off the creature's dead glassy eyes. It hesitated for a second, tilting its head toward him. Samir didn't hesitate. He jumped, straight into the chasm below, and the creature followed. For a long time, we didn't move, didn't breathe. All of us were in shock at what had just happened. Had Samir really sacrificed his own life to save us? We didn't think about it too much at that point. We were just trying to make it down the mountain. For hours, we endured exhaustion, freezing winds, broken tracks, and everything Everest tried to throw at us. And by the time the sun rose, we reached base camp, but barely alive. The rescue teams didn't believe us. They said altitude sickness causes hallucinations, that we were confused, exhausted, that Everest plays tricks on the mind. We didn't argue, because only we knew the truth. We had encountered something on Everest Horrifying secret of Mount Everest. The first body was frozen solid, half buried in the snow, its face locked in a silent scream. I almost stepped on it. The ice had preserved it well, too well. The skin was tight, stretched over bone like old leather. The eyes still open, glassy and black. It looked fresh, but that was impossible. The gear was outdated, something from a climb decades ago. No ID, no sign of what happened, just left here, forgotten. I had seen corpses on Everest before. Everyone had. The mountain was littered with them, frozen reminders of those who didn't make it. But this one felt different, wrong. It wasn't slumped over like a climber who simply ran out of oxygen. It was on its back, arms stretched out, fingers stiff, as if it had died reaching for something. I swallowed hard, adjusting my grip on the ice axe. The wind howled through the ridge, bringing with it the sound of my team's voices up ahead. "James, you good?" It was Sam, my climbing partner, a veteran on the mountain. His voice cut through the wind, grounding me. I forced myself to turn away from the corpse, moving to catch up with the others. We had a job to do. We were here to find the missing climbers. 3 people, gone without a trace. Their last radio call had come from this ridge. Then, nothing. I glanced back once. The body hadn't moved, but somehow, it felt like it was watching. We pushed forward, following the faint trail of footprints half filled with snow. They were recent, too recent. The missing climbers had passed through here not long ago. That should have been good news. It wasn't. The higher we climbed, the worse the feeling got. The silence was unbearable. Everest was never truly silent. There was always the wind, the distant groan of shifting ice. But up here, it felt empty. An hour later, we found their camp. The tents were still standing, zipped shut, their walls flapping in the wind. Gear lay scattered around, oxygen tanks, ropes, supplies, untouched. If they had abandoned camp, they had done it in a hurry, too much of a hurry. Sam unzipped one of the tents and froze. I moved to his side and felt my stomach drop. Inside, 3 sleeping bags lay zipped up, but they weren't empty. The missing climbers were still inside. They looked asleep, peaceful, except for one thing. Their faces were gone, not eaten, not decayed, just gone. A smooth, featureless layer of pale skin where their eyes, nose, and mouth should have been. The radio on my belt crackled. Then, through the static, I heard something I will never forget. A whisper, "Turn back." And then, from inside the frozen tents, the sleeping bags began to move. Sam stumbled back, nearly falling into the snow. "What the hell?" His voice caught in his throat as the sleeping bags twitched again. It wasn't the wind. Something was moving inside. My pulse hammered in my ears as I yanked the zipper down on my jacket, reaching for the knife strapped to my chest. I had no idea what I was going to do with it, but my body acted on instinct. Something was wrong. Then the first one sat up. No struggle, no slow, jerky movement like a frozen corpse shifting in its final moments. Just smooth, unnatural motion, like it had never been asleep at all. The other 2 followed, their movements eerily synchronized, their heads turned toward us, and even though they had no eyes, I knew they were looking. Sam said something under his breath, backing toward the edge of camp. No way, no way. I should have run. I should have turned and followed him, left the cursed bodies where they sat, but my feet wouldn't move because something wasn't right. The snow around them was undisturbed. Then they began to stand, not climb out of the sleeping bags. Stand. The fabric stretched unnaturally, lifting with them, the zippers staying sealed. That was it. I ran. We sprinted out of camp, tearing through the snow, breathing too hard, moving too fast. Sam was shouting something into his radio, but the static was overwhelming. Then, behind us, a sound, not footsteps, not breathing, a low, wet whisper. "Turn back." We ran faster. The higher we climbed, the harder it got to breathe. Our oxygen tanks were running low, but there was no time to stop. Every few seconds, I looked back, half expecting to see them, those things, whatever they were, but there was nothing, only the empty, untouched snow. That didn't make it better, it made it worse. "James," Sam panted beside me, "we need to go down, now." He was right. Whatever had happened to the missing climbers, whatever was left of them, we weren't supposed to see it. This wasn't a normal rescue mission. It wasn't even about survival anymore. Everest didn't want us here. We veered west, trying to find a path back toward base camp. The wind screamed in our ears, drowning out everything else. The mountain was shifting around us, visibility dropping. It was too dangerous to keep moving, but we had no choice. Then Sam stopped. I nearly slammed into him before I saw why. There was a figure standing ahead, not moving, not reacting to the wind. A climber. At first, I thought maybe, it was another body, frozen in place like so many before. Then I saw its hands. They were raw, bloody. The fingers curled like they had been digging. The suit was torn, patches of skin black with frostbite. And it was smiling. No lips, no teeth, just a slit where a mouth should have been. The whisper returned, curling through the wind. You were warned. Then the thing moved. Sam didn't wait. He fired. His pistol cracked through the thin air, the muzzle flash lighting up the frozen nightmare in front of us. The first shot hit the thing square in the chest. It didn't react. The second hit its face. No blood, no impact, like the bullets had been swallowed by something not entirely there. Then it lunged, faster than something in that condition should have moved. A blur of tattered fabric and raw, ruined flesh. Sam barely dodged as the thing's hand swiped through the air where his throat had been. I grabbed my ice axe and swung without thinking. The blade bit deep into its shoulder, sinking in too easily, like the flesh wasn't real. No resistance, no bone, just something soft and hollow beneath the skin. The thing let out a sound, a gurgled breath, like wind rushing through a dead throat. It twisted its head toward me, and for the first time, I saw its eyes. Or rather, where its eyes should have been. The sockets weren't empty. They were sealed over. The skin stretched smooth like wax melted over a candle. Yet somehow, I knew it could see me. Sam grabbed me, yanking me backward. We have to go. He was right. I tore the axe free and we ran. The wind howled, the world shrinking around us. The blizzard thickening into a wall of swirling white. We couldn't see more than a few feet ahead, but we didn't stop. I looked back once, just once, and saw shapes moving in the snow. More of them, standing between the ice and the storm. Their bodies shifting unnaturally, heads tilting in unison. The ground beneath us started to slope downward, the steep edge of a ridge coming into view. We had no choice. We had to climb down, fast. Sam threw the first rope, securing it to a frozen rock face. His movements frantic but steady. We were nearly out of oxygen. If we didn't get lower soon, it wouldn't matter what was chasing us. We'd be dead either way. He clipped in first, scaling down the ridge as fast as the frozen gear would let him. I followed, the ice axe digging into the wall with each breath. My fingers were numb, my vision tunneling, the cold seeping deep into my bones. Halfway down, I heard the sound again. Not the wind, not the storm, a whisper. It was right above me. I made the mistake of looking up. One of them was crawling over the edge. It wasn't climbing down. It was moving like an insect, hands gripping the ice without effort, its body contorting in unnatural ways. The slit of its mouth opened wider, its head twisting at an impossible angle. It was grinning. I moved faster, too fast, my boot slipping against the ice. The rope jerked, the harness cutting into my ribs. I barely held on. Sam was shouting something below me, but the wind ate his words. The thing kept coming, its fingers dragging across the ice, leaving no marks. Then it stopped, just inches from me. And in my head, a voice that wasn't mine whispered, "You are almost home." Then the ice broke. The world fell away. I wasn't sure if I was falling or if the mountain had simply let me go. The rope snapped tight, my body jerking midair before I slammed into the ice wall hard. Pain exploded through my ribs. My vision blurred. Keep moving. Keep moving. Sam was below me, struggling to find footing as the storm worsened, ice pelting us like bullets. My hands were barely working. The cold had taken most of my strength. But I forced my grip tighter around the axe, planting it deep into the frozen rock. 1 inch at a time, I lowered myself toward Sam, fighting through the pain. Above me, the thing was still there. It hadn't followed. It didn't need to, because it knew something I didn't. We reached the bottom of the ridge, our feet slamming onto solid ground, but we weren't safe. The storm had changed. The wind wasn't howling anymore. It was whispering, the same words, over and over, in voices I almost recognized. Turn back. Sam grabbed my arm, pulling me forward. We need to find shelter. Shelter. There was no shelter, only the dead mountain, and the things that never left it. Then, ahead of us, a shape, a building, small, half buried in snow, almost invisible in the storm. A weather station, our only chance. We ran. The things followed. We reached the weather station, the metal door half buried under layers of ice and snow. Sam slammed into it first, clawing at the frozen handle, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The storm had become something alive, a twisting mass of white swallowing the mountain behind us. They were still out there, moving just beyond the edge of our vision, shifting in and out of the swirling snow like shadows that had never belonged to anything human. The door wouldn't budge, frozen solid. I didn't think, just reacted. Brought my ice axe down hard, again and again, chipping away the ice, smashing at the handle until something cracked. Sam threw his shoulder into it one last time, and suddenly we were inside. We fell through, landing in a heap on the frozen floor as the door slammed shut behind us, sealing out the wind. For a moment, we just breathed. Cold, sharp lungfuls of air, our bodies shaking from more than just the temperature. My hands were raw, stiff, my fingers barely able to unclasp from the axe. Sam sat up, blinking against the dim light filtering through cracks in the walls. The station was abandoned, a single-room structure, long forgotten, its equipment coated in frost, a layer of dust thick on the metal consoles. A desk stood in the corner, covered in old notebooks, their pages stiff with ice. A radio sat in the middle of it all, its buttons cracked, its speaker dead. I stood up, my body protesting every movement, and crossed to the desk. My breath caught in my throat as I saw what was in the notebooks. Names, dozens of them, some with dates beside them, others scratched out entirely. I flipped through the pages, my pulse hammering. These weren't just records. They were logs of missing climbers. Every name belonged to someone who had vanished on Everest over the decades. And at the bottom of the last page, one name had been scrawled in shaky, desperate handwriting. Mine. I didn't move. Couldn't move. Sam must have seen my face because he came up beside me, looking over my shoulder. He was quiet for a long time. Then, voice barely above a whisper, he said, "James, look at the date." I did, and everything inside me turned to ice. The date was today. The ink was still wet. Sam slammed the notebook shut, his hands shaking. "No way. No way." He turned, pacing the room, his breath ragged, like the walls were closing in on him. I wanted to say something, to tell him there had to be an explanation, but there wasn't. There was no explanation for any of this. The things in the snow, the whispers, the frozen bodies, my name, written in a book that shouldn't have existed. Then, a sound, a tap, light, gentle, against the door. Sam and I both went still. Another tap, a rhythmic knock, slow and deliberate. Not the wind, not an accident. Something was outside. Sam grabbed his pistol, his hands trembling. "Don't move." I didn't. The knocking stopped. Then, from the other side of the door, a voice. My voice. "James, let me in." Every hair on my body rose. Sam's grip on the gun tightened, his knuckles white. The voice was identical to mine, but it wasn't mine. Because I was standing right here, the thing outside knocked again. "James, it's cold. Let me in." It was mocking me. Then, from the window, movement. A shadow shifting against the glass, something pressing against it. Peering inside, I turned slowly, and what I saw nearly made me scream. It was me, standing in the snow, staring back at me. Same face, same gear, same eyes, but its skin was pale, too pale, and when it smiled, its mouth stretched too wide. Then, behind it, more figures emerged from the storm. Sam raised the pistol, his breath uneven. "We're not getting out of this, are we?" The thing outside, the thing that looked like me, grinned. And then, in a voice that wasn't mine, but still was, it whispered, "You were always here." The thing outside kept staring, its grin stretching too wide, lips curling in a way that shouldn't be possible. Sam didn't lower the gun, but I knew it wouldn't matter. Bullets hadn't worked before. They wouldn't work now. The others, the shapes in the storm, stood motionless behind it, their outlines barely visible through the frost-covered glass, watching, waiting. My skin crawled as the wind outside began to change. No longer howling, no longer random. It was whispering, the voices layered over each other, speaking in tongues, speaking in our voices. Sam took a step toward the window, his breath slow, controlled. "We can't stay here," he muttered. "We're trapped." He wasn't wrong. The weather station felt smaller now, suffocating. The walls were thin, the air growing thick with something unseen. My name in that notebook burned in my mind. I wasn't supposed to be here, but the mountain, it wanted me here. Then, the door handle turned. It didn't rattle, didn't shake, just a smooth, confident turn, like whoever, or whatever, was outside, knew it was about to be let in. Sam raised the gun, and I did the only thing I could think of. I slammed my body against the door. The impact sent a sharp jolt through my ribs, but the handle stopped moving. For now, Sam was already moving, grabbing one of the broken desks, dragging it toward the entrance. We piled everything we could find against it. Chairs, metal cabinets, anything to buy time. The whispering outside didn't stop. If anything, it laughed. And then, the radio crackled. The old dead radio on the desk flickered to life. Static at first, then a voice. Weak, distant. "Hello? Anyone there? Please, God." Someone respond. Sam and I froze. The voice was male, shaking, desperate. Not one of the things outside. I scrambled for the radio, my fingers numb as I pressed the button. This is Dr. James Carter. We're trapped at an abandoned weather station. Position unknown. Who is this? Silence. Static. Then, the voice came again. I don't know. I don't know where I am. My stomach twisted. What do you mean? The man let out a broken, gasping sound. I think I'm inside the mountain. And then, the radio screamed. Not static, not feedback. A sound so sharp and unnatural, it felt like it was inside my skull. Drilling into my mind, unraveling something that shouldn't be unraveled. Sam and I both hit the ground, clutching our heads, the room spinning, warping, twisting around us. And then, silence. We opened our eyes. The door was open. The barricade was still in place. The chairs, the desks, everything we'd thrown in front of it untouched. But the door itself stood slightly ajar, a thin line of white cutting through the darkness. The wind outside had stopped. No more whispers, no more laughter, just silence. Sam pushed himself up, gripping his pistol with white-knuckled hands. Tell me we didn't open that. I couldn't. I stood slowly, my breath coming in short gasps. The air inside the weather station felt wrong now, heavier, tainted. The walls seemed off, as if they weren't walls anymore, as if they were something else. The shadows felt deeper, darker, and then I saw the footprints in the snow outside the door, leading away. Sam saw them too. He swallowed hard. Those weren't there before. He was right. I forced myself to step closer, gripping the edge of the doorframe. The prints were fresh, deep, leading away from the station, down into the snow, disappearing into the storm. But it wasn't the fact that they were footprints that made my blood run cold. It was the fact that they looked exactly like mine. Identical, same boot tread, same stride, like I had already walked out of here, like I had already left. Sam backed away, his voice low, unsteady. We have to go, right now. I didn't argue. Whatever had been hunting us, whatever had been inside the mountain, it was done waiting. We grabbed our remaining gear, anything that could keep us alive, and stepped into the open air. The storm had changed. It wasn't blinding anymore, wasn't trying to swallow us whole. It had softened, almost guiding us. The footprints led downward, toward base camp, toward home. But as we took those first careful steps, as we followed the tracks through the endless white, I couldn't shake the feeling settling deep in my gut. Something wasn't right. Something had changed. And then I heard it. The whisper. But it wasn't behind me anymore. It was inside my head. And this time, it sounded just like me. We moved fast, our bodies numb, our minds fractured. The footprints in the snow led downward, guiding us through the ridges and ice fields. But I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't following them. We were repeating them, like we had already done this before. Like this was a path we had walked 100 times without remembering. The whisper in my head was faint now, a low murmur just beneath my thoughts, like an echo of something old, something that had been there long before we arrived on the mountain. Sam was silent as we descended. He didn't speak, didn't look at me, just moved, focused. But his breathing was wrong, shallow, uneven. And then, suddenly, he stopped. I turned to him, my stomach twisting. Sam, he didn't respond. He was staring ahead, down the path, eyes locked onto something in the distance. I followed his gaze, and my breath caught in my throat. The weather station was in front of us, but that was impossible. We had left it behind. We had been walking away from it, but there it was, right where it shouldn't be. The old metal structure, half buried in the snow. The door still slightly open, as if we had never left. My mind screamed that this couldn't be real, but the whisper in my head, it laughed. I turned to Sam, panic rising. This is wrong. We're stuck in something. Then I saw his face, and I knew it wasn't Sam anymore. The thing standing next to me had his body, his gear, his rifle slung over his shoulder just like before. But his eyes, they were wrong, empty, like something had hollowed him out from the inside. He turned his head toward me slowly, too slowly, and then he smiled. Not like Sam, not like a human, like the things in the snow. Then, in my own voice, he whispered, "You were always here." I ran. Didn't think, didn't breathe, just ran. The snow beneath my boots felt endless, the wind closing in on me like walls, like a cage. The whisper grew louder, twisting inside my skull, repeating words I didn't want to hear. The mountain stretched in all directions, no longer making sense. I wasn't descending, I was lost, but I couldn't stop. I didn't look back, not at the thing wearing Sam's face, not at the station that shouldn't have been there. I ran until the world blurred, until my lungs burned, until I couldn't tell if I was going down or up or in circles. Then, a sound, not the whisper, not the storm, a helicopter. At first, I thought I was imagining it, a cruel trick of the mind. But then I saw it, dark against the gray sky, hovering near a rocky clearing. A rescue team, real, moving, landing, a figure stepping out in heavy winter gear, waving toward me. I forced my body forward, my legs barely working, my vision fading at the edges. But I didn't stop. I collapsed near the landing zone, arms outstretched, fingers clutching at the ground as hands grabbed me, pulled me onto the chopper. Voices, real voices. Someone pressed an oxygen mask to my face. I could barely see, barely hear. The last thing I remembered was the pilot shouting, "We found one." And then, darkness. I woke up in a hospital 3 days later. They told me I had severe hypothermia, oxygen deprivation, minor frostbite. I was lucky. Lucky. They told me Sam had never been found. They told me they searched, but there was no sign of him. No bodies, no weather station, nothing. I didn't tell them what I had seen. I didn't tell them about the whispers, the shadows, the faces that weren't faces. I didn't tell them that sometimes, in the stillness of the hospital at night, I could still hear something soft, distant, a voice that sounded just like mine. A week later, they discharged me. I left, walked outside, breathing fresh air for the first time in what felt like centuries. And then I saw them, across the street, standing perfectly still. A man in climbing gear, his hood pulled back just enough for me to see his face. He smiled,